Coming up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I am Susan Kelly, President-elect of the City Club. Welcome to another outstanding and timely City Club Friday Forum. The subject of the challenges we face in understanding our neighbors since this country has become the most religiously diverse nation in the world, and particularly in light of the events of September 11th. Our special guest today is Dr. Diana Eck of Harvard University's Pluralism Project. Our co-sponsor for today's program is Trinity Episcopal Cathedral, who made Dr. Eck's appearance here possible. Friday, October 26th, join us for another program in our series entitled When Disaster Strikes, Emergency Preparedness in Oregon. Our special guests will be Myra Thompson-Lee, Director of the Office of Emergency Management for the State of Oregon, Dr. Gran Higginson, State Public Health Officer for the Oregon Health Division, and Major Greg Williford of the Oregon State Police, and that program will be here at the Mac Club. All you City Club members have received a pledge card and letter asking you to participate generously in this year's annual fund campaign. Just as we have united to support our nation and the victims of our recent tragedy, we must also remain united in support of nonprofit organizations like City Club, an organization that has grown leaders and helped to inspire the growth of outstanding citizens in the community, in our community, for over 85 years. Thanks to the generosity of our corporate friends and lead gifts from our Board of Governors and annual fund team members, we have already surpassed 61,000. Please join us and help us surpass the goal, which is 95. Thanks. For those of you who may not be aware, the City Club website offers access to research reports, past club program presentations, upcoming events, and membership information. Check us out at www.pdxcityclub.org. And if you haven't looked at it for a while, you might want to, as it's been completely redesigned. Our member host today is Jane Cease, a member of the Board of Governors. She will ask the first question of our speaker. Following Jane's question, we will open the program to questions from City Club members in the audience. Please line up behind the mic even before Jane is finished so that we have time to ask as many questions as possible. Please identify yourself as a member of the club and ask your question in 30 seconds or less. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from the following: Legacy Health Systems, Pope and Talbot, and Washington Mutual Savings, and we are very grateful for their support. Before I begin the introduction, I just want to point out that today, City Club member David Leslie, who is the Director of Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, is at the Coast in Florence, speaking to our sister City Club on religious pluralism and politics at this very lunchtime. Kind of links us locally and globally, doesn't it? Our speaker today is Diana Eck, Professor of Comparative Religion and Indian Studies at Harvard University, where she serves on the commission on the study of religion in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Professor Eck has been brought to Portland this weekend by the Center for Spiritual Development, a program of Trinity Episcopal Cathedral. Diana will be giving a major lecture tonight at Trinity at 7:30. Tomorrow there'll be a workshop from 9 to 2:30. Also at the cathedral, and it's titled Christians and the Encounter with Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims. Information is available on cards at your table. The director of the center is Reverend Marianne Wells Borg, who is with us today, as well as others from the center and guests from the Muslim and Jewish communities. Reverend Borg will be initiating an ongoing dialogue with Muslims, Christians, and Jewish communities, and she has extended the invitation to City Club members to please join. So more on that later. Thank you, Marianne, for bringing Professor Eck to Portland and sharing her with City Club. Professor Eck received her BA from Smith College in Religion, her MA from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and her Ph.D. from Harvard in Comparative Study of Religion. At Harvard since 1991, she has been leading a research team to explore the new religious diversity that has evolved in this country over the past 30 years. It is called the Pluralism Project, and it's funded by Lilly Endowment, Pew Charitable Trust, and Ford and Rockefeller Foundations. The project has been documenting the growing presence of Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, Jain, and Zoroastrian communities in the U.S. Diana has published numerous books. In 1995, she won the prestigious Gromeyer Book Award for Encountering God, a work that reflects a significant breakthrough in our understanding of religion. In 1998, she received the National Humanities Medal from President Clinton and the National Endowment for the Humanities for her work on American religious pluralism. In June, her latest book was published. It's called A New Religious America, How a Christian Country Has Become the World's Most Diverse Nation, and is available today courtesy of Looking Glass Books. Diana will be available to sign copies for a few minutes after the program. I've read many enthusiastic reviews that were written before September 11th, but I have to tell you, the book is much more significant now. I am honored to present our speaker, Professor Diana Eck.
Thank you very much, Susan. It is a great pleasure to be here at the City Club. I found in discussing some of the heritage of the club over lunch with Susan Kelly that one of my oldest friends from Bozeman, Montana, with whom I grew up, actually spoke last week, Jim Huffman, who was the dean of the law school here. So we both come from that small town in Montana and are both coping in very different ways with the new America in which we now live. A new religious America is something that I discover and that strikes me, still catches me by surprise as I travel around the United States in my work and as I receive the reports of my students who work on this topic. A huge mosque rises in the farmlands outside Toledo or in one of the suburbs of Cleveland or in Seattle or Portland or hundreds of other cities in the United States. A Thai temple, a Buddhist temple, is situated with a backdrop of Douglas fir in the outskirts of Seattle. The large Shilai temple of Chinese Buddhist origin sits in the eastern suburbs of Los Angeles in Hacienda Heights. And the Jade Buddha temple in one of those large strip malls of Houston, and the Zhuangyan Monastery in the northern suburbs of New York City. And Hindu temples as well, like the huge temple in the suburbs of Atlanta, in Riverdale, or in the suburbs of Chicago, or in the western suburbs of Nashville, or in the suburbs of Boston, where the temple was dedicated in 1991 with waters brought from the sacred river Ganges in India, mingled with the waters of the Mississippi and the Colorado and the Missouri rivers of the United States. All of this provides a kind of visible architectural evidence of a new chapter in American life. And that really has been what the Pluralism Project has set out to investigate over the last 10 years. I myself started out as a scholar of India and did a lot of my original scholarly work in the Indian context, studying the complexities of a multi-religious subcontinent and its tensions and its difficulties. But about 1990, I started studying the United States as well, discovering that, in fact, in my own classes, there were the second generation of new immigrants to the United States who had come and by that time grown and gone to college. And there they were, Muslims who had grown up in Pittsburgh, and Hindus in Cleveland, and Jains and Sikhs from across the United States. So we set out to discover what the United States was becoming and asked three kinds of questions. First, who's here in a city like Portland or in Oklahoma City or in San Francisco or Boston? Second, how are these religious communities changing in the American context? And third, and perhaps most important, how's America changing in the light of this new multi-religious reality? The visible institutions of this new period of immigration have been part of what we have studied. But it really began with the 1965 Immigration Act, with which many of you are familiar, but if you're not, I should say a word about it. Because we have been a nation of immigrants, as you know, all along. And this has not been without its rocky roads and difficulties. One of them being the fact that immigrants came into land that was already home to many native peoples, from sea to shining sea. And though the Statue of Liberty stood in New York Harbor with the inscription, "Give me your tired and your poor, your yearning masses, toiling masses, yearning to breathe free," we didn't have a Statue of Liberty in San Francisco Harbor where people from China came, or Japan, or in Puget Sound, where we had immigrants arriving from Northwest India, Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims. And indeed, throughout the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, many of these people who came to the United States were not welcome with open arms. Beginning in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first that was passed, and in the debate over Chinese exclusion in Congress, there were people who said, these civilizations can never mix. They're like oil and water. The China-raised person can never become an American citizen. By the 1890s, the Japanese had come to the United States and fared little better. Their first temples in the west coast of the Buddhist churches of America, what became known as the BCA temples, devotional Shin Buddhist temples, built in 1900, 1903, 1905, and yet those Buddhists could not become American citizens. And in the 19-teens, the Sikhs came with their turbans and their energies, mostly from the Northwest, down from Vancouver, and encountered in places like Bellingham, where they worked in the lumber mills, the kind of animosity against them that came from nativist Americans. They called them ragheads and insulted and denigrated them. And by the turn of the century, we had the Asiatic Exclusion League, which dealt with the question of this difference in America by saying that too much difference was unacceptable, and that the way to deal with it was to exclude it. And that really is a question that has haunted us and pursued us ever since. How do we deal with cultural, religious difference in the United States of America? There have been those who have argued to exclude it. There have been those who have argued to melt it down, to erase it, to come to America but shed the differences of culture or religion or ethnicity that you bring with you. And there have also been those who have contended from the beginning that we as Americans have a right to our differences, a right to our ethnic, our cultural, and our religious differences in the context of a common covenant of citizenship. So this argument goes on, but along about 1924, the exclusionists won out, basically. The doors of immigration were closed, and for the next several generations, there was no fresh immigration from anywhere, but most of all from anywhere in Asia. And by the 1950s, we had become what the sociologist Will Herberg called a three-religion country: Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. But at the same time, we had a deep-seated contradiction that was gnawing at our American conscience, and it was articulated pretty well by Robert Kennedy when he was Attorney General just after John F. Kennedy was elected president. And it went something like this. We have been working to eliminate racial discrimination in American life, at least in all of the legal aspects of American life, for decades. And it is impossible to go on keeping racial discrimination as the cornerstone of our immigration policy. And so by 1965, after the death of John F. Kennedy, a new immigration policy was signed into law at the base of the Statue of Liberty by Lyndon Johnson. And it opened the doors of immigration to people who would be welcome to America, to the American workforce from all over the world. And gradually, in the course of these 35 plus years now, the cultural and religious composition of America has begun to change. Most of us have noticed it. In fact, there are very few places you can live in the United States without it being really evident. And yet many Americans are still surprised now in 2001 to discover that there are between 5 and 7 million Muslims in the U.S., meaning more Muslims than Jews, more Muslims than Episcopalians by far, even more Muslims than members of the Presbyterian Church USA. And many are surprised to learn that Los Angeles is probably the most interesting Buddhist city in the entire world, with Buddhists from all over Asia, part of the mix of some 300 Buddhist temples in the greater Los Angeles area. Buddhists from Korea and Japan and China, Southeast Asia, those who came in the backwash of the war in Southeast Asia, and also the many streams of Euro and African American Buddhists who have adopted this way of faith as their own. And then Hindus as well. We know that in our hospitals and in our professional lives there are many immigrants from South Asia who are doctors or engineers, and yet most people never stop to think about the fact that they also do have a religious life, that they probably stop at the altar in their home, transformed from a coat closet or a kitchen cupboard, or maybe a separate family room that has been made into a home shrine, that they stop for prayer before they go off to work in the morning, that they may go to the temple in the suburbs on the weekends, that they opened a session of the U.S. Congress with prayer in September just a year ago. We don't know about those things. Over the course of these years, America has become a multi-religious nation of Buddhists and Baha'is and Hindus and Jains and Sikhs and Zoroastrians and Muslims. And of course, even our Christian and Jewish communities have become much more diverse. Everyone knows the numbers of Christians who have come from Korea and from Africa and from Taiwan, and of course the transformation of American Christianity with the Latino-Hispanic immigration. America is a unique nation religiously based on the non-establishment and the free exercise of religion. And the strength of religion in the U.S. is defined not by the majority, but by a fabric of pluralism that all of us have a part in, and in which we are all engaged, religious and, I might add, non-religious as well. For one of the great freedoms of the United States is the freedom not to be religious, no matter where you come from. The freedom to have a secular life that is not impinged upon by the religious currents of our time. But we, the people of the United States of America, has become much more complex, and our diversity is alone will not carry us into the century ahead. Our diversity is simply a fact. How we deal with that diversity is the important question. Do we deal with it in a way that wants to ignore it or wish it away? Do we deal with it in a way that wants to assimilate it so that people shed these differences? Or do we encounter that diversity in a way that I would describe as pluralism, the engagement of our differences in creating a common society? Now let me turn to the catastrophe of September 11th. People of every race and nationality, and Americans of every religious tradition, died in the conflagration and implosion of the Twin Towers. A Hindu boy who had recently attended the 60th wedding anniversary of his grandparents and performed the puja went down from the 102nd floor. More than 250 people of South Asian origin, most of them Americans, were killed. And if we begin to look at the same places that I studied along with my students over the course of the last 10 years, all of them mourned this disaster. At the Shilai Temple in Hacienda Heights and the Chuangnian Monastery in Kent, New York, there were prayers to the Bodhisattva of compassion spread upon their web pages and participation in the National Day of Mourning. The Dalai Lama sent an open letter to President Bush and to the American people. The Hindu temple in Queens displayed a flag and the label "Attack on America" on its router page, with services listed to pray for the victims. And in Dutchess County, in the Hudson Valley, the Hindu temple held a blood drive and a prayer service on September 14th. And the Jains, a nonviolent people, also from India about the time of the Buddha, opened a session of the Ohio State Senate with prayers for the victims of the tragedy. Sikhs had candlelit vigils in their gurdwaras. And then we turn to the Islamic communities. A reporter for the Austin, Texas American Statesman wrote a wonderful article, the headline of which was, "Visitors flock to local mosque to learn more and show support." This was on September 24th, and she spoke of an open house that was held at the mosque in Austin, Texas, and there have been hundreds of them across the United States. The Muslims of this community were surprised at the hundreds of people who came during this 3-hour period, amazed at the turnout. A Presbyterian woman said, "It's time to reach out to people of other faiths and rally together as Americans and get in touch with who we really are." And another said, "The time of not getting to know each other is over." The time of not getting to know each other is over. The past 5 weeks have shown an unprecedented level of a new religious discourse in America. The afternoon of September 11th, really by 1 o'clock, I had received an email from the Muslim Public Affairs Council based in Southern California, citing the statement, a joint statement of 4 American Muslim political groups, of their unequivocal, quote, condemnation based on our religious values and our identity as American Muslims. The American Muslim Council, based in Washington, D.C., that same group that had been engaged in voter registration drives just a year ago during the presidential campaign, called on all mosques and Islamic centers in America to participate in the National Day of Mourning. And new organizations grew as well. Within 2 weeks, there was an organization launched by professionals, young professionals in New York, called Muslims Against Terrorism, and you can look up their sort of postmodern website on the web. Their purpose, quote, to stand against those who preach violence in the name of Islam, to promote peace through interfaith and intercultural coalition building. Mosques had open houses, as I said, and in Cambridge as well, the Islamic Society of Boston sent a letter to the entire Cambridge community that began, "Greetings and peace be upon you. We write to you with heavy hearts, joining the rest of the nation in mourning the tremendous loss of life on Tuesday. We utterly condemn the use of terror to further any political or religious cause. As Muslims, we abhor the killing of innocent civilians. The Quran teaches, if anyone kills an innocent person, it is as if he has killed all of humanity. And if anyone saves a life, it is as if he has saved all humanity." And then we saw President Bush visiting a mosque in Washington, D.C., speaking of Islam as a religion of peace. We saw the National Day of Mourning, the service at the cathedral in Washington, in which a Muslim participated for the first time in this kind of national day of observance. I might remind you that after the Oklahoma City tragedy, even though Muslims were immediately seen as suspect, and the number of threats and attacks on Islamic centers and Muslim people and Arab Americans numbered about 200. Muslims were not invited to participate in the service in Oklahoma City, even though there are many mosques there, and even though they apparently made initiatives to participate. This was a first, and we saw Muzammil Siddiqui, the head of the Islamic Society of North America, speaking in the National Cathedral. And then the outreach to learn more, the kind of yearning that we saw over these weeks in things like Oprah having Islam 101 on her daytime show, and Larry King having Meher Hathout from the Islamic Center in Southern California into one of his usually fairly conservative and obnoxious dialogues between right-wing people of all faiths. But it was a first. And so I think of the words of that woman in Austin, the time of not getting to know each other is indeed over. But then, immediately on September 11th as well, the backlash started against Muslims, Arab Americans, eventually Sikhs as well. A sense of anger, of helplessness, the language of war being bandied about, but against vague and unseen enemies. And people went about looking for enemies, for retribution. And already by September 12th, there were reports. Religious communities were focused upon as targets, and that was not new. We have seen over the course of American history the ways in which religious communities become a kind of icon of the difference of the other, even when the differences have very little to do with religion. Black churches being burned, mosques being the target of arson attacks in Yuba City, California in 1993 to Minneapolis in 1999. Hindu temples being vandalized, as in Pittsburgh when vandals broke into the temple and smashed the deities, wrote the word leave across the altar. So this has not been new. But over the course of these weeks, more than 700 incidents have been reported, and 170 now being pursued as hate crimes by the U.S. Department of Justice. People who are visible have also been seen as vulnerable. Muslim women fearing to go to work wearing the hijab, harassed picking up their children at school, on public transportation, a clerk at an Islamic bookstore in Queens cowering inside the store on the afternoon of September 11th. A brick wrapped in paper filled with comments of hate tied with rubber bands thrown through the window of an Islamic bookstore in Alexandria, Virginia, or a car driven through the glass door of the mosque in Cleveland. And against Sikhs as well, since the turbaned Sikhs, especially Sikh men, struck some people as looking a bit like Osama bin Laden himself. Assaulted with a baseball bat, shot with paintball guns, harassed at the workplace, at the gas station. The Guru Gobind Singh Gurdwara, again in Cleveland, set on fire. 52 hate crimes reported by the Sikh Media Action Resources Task Force, a group called SMART, within 2 weeks. And the murder that next Saturday of Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh gentleman who ran a gas station and convenience store in Mesa, Arizona. And Hindus as well. The Hari Om temple in Chicago vandalized, a temple in New Jersey, a convenience store in Somerset, Massachusetts, run by a man named Patel, who was from Gujarat, who protested he was not a Muslim. In fact, he didn't even eat meat, etc. He was a vegetarian, don't mistake me. But a sense that these were the other in our midst. And some of these have been tragic indeed. A Pakistani store owner in Pleasant Grove, Texas, shot and killed. And a Coptic Christian who had fled Egypt 20 years ago because of religious persecution, killed in San Gabriel, California. And then finally, let me close by simply saying this is also not the end of the story. There's the backlash to the backlash, the outpouring of support for every one of these incidents of retaliation and hatred, 1,000 people coming forward to say this is not who we are. In Arizona, for example, where Balbir Singh Sodhi was murdered, nearly 3,000 people gathered in Phoenix, black and white and Sikh and Jew and Christian and Muslim, most of them not knowing Sodhi at all, but offering prayers and songs and compassion and sympathy. The resounding cry that this is not America, this is not who we are. And similarly, that brick through the Palestinian-owned bookstore associated with a mosque in Alexandria, Virginia. Within 24 hours, the bookstore was flooded with bouquets of flowers and with cards, utterly overwhelming the bookstore owner with the sense of a new family that he had gathered in the backwash of this hate crime. And the Washington Post summed it all up in a story on the 6th of October, for Muslims, benevolence prevailing over backlash. And it tells, among many things, the story of a Muslim woman in Winchester, Virginia, who went to a restaurant with two non-Muslim friends. She was wearing hijab. They were all a little bit edgy. And after they had been served, the waitress came over to the table, and they were feeling, anxious, as if something was about to happen. And she handed back the $30 they had paid for lunch. She said the restaurant wanted to give them a free meal. She knelt by our table, said the Muslim woman, and was very sympathetic, saying she was very proud that I had the strength to wear Islamic attire. And the waitress walked away in tears. Finally, in the last few weeks, really since September 11th itself, the New York Times, in its sort of second section, has a separate section of news that, if you read the New York Times, is called A Nation Challenged, that is basically the summing up of things that have happened in the United States as a result of the catastrophe of September 11th. And I think it's very well named. We are, at this point in our history, a nation challenged. And we're challenged in a great many ways. To affirm our ideals as a civilian and democratic society, to affirm our commitments to human rights and to civil rights and to the free exercise of religion, even in the face of this act of terror, to affirm a strong fabric of pluralism through an energetic commitment to one another, through the give and take of dialogue, the listening, the critique, the sympathy that is part of the rush hour traffic of dialogue. And above all, to move beyond the stereotype, the half-baked truths that we have of neighbors, religious neighbors that we do not know, to relationships with religious neighbors that we here in America have the opportunity to come to know. Neighbors who are not simply imaginary, metaphorical neighbors around the world, but neighbors across the street, neighbors across town, neighbors in our own communities. And this is the challenge that is part of the nation challenge we are today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Eck. As you talked, I was thinking back to what I feel we've been going through in this country with perhaps our own homegrown, what I once called the terrorists of the religious right, and got lots of phone calls about it. But and thinking that what September 11th might have done to that. And I guess my question really is, how can we keep what you call the backlash to the backlash ongoing? What kinds of things can each of us do every day to keep the backlash to the hateful backlash from continuing, and how can we help in that way?
That's a great question, because I think, as I was concluding, was saying basically one of the most important things we can do is to begin creating a web of relationships with people in our own communities. One of the things that's happened in the past 10 years about is just the explosion in the U.S. of interfaith and interreligious councils and networks in cities and towns all over the place. And not just in big cities where they have old interreligious networks like in Los Angeles or Washington, D.C., but in places like Lincoln, Nebraska or Omaha, where, where there is a substantial presence of new immigrants and where the opportunities for really creating an interfaith network are great. And I think that, there are many ways in which that kind of thing can develop, but there's a kind of people-to-people neighborliness in the United States that needs to be cultivated at this time in our history. And one of the things that I was most struck by many stories, because we basically collect these in the Pluralism Project. If you want to read about the backlash and the backlash to the backlash, go to www.pluralism.org, and you will see the section we call In the News that basically gathers together on an ongoing basis what's happening in the multi-religious life of the United States. But one of the stories that came up was a story of a man who was just about to close the mosque down in one of the big downtown mosques in Los Angeles. And someone wandered into the mosque and said he just wanted to come face to face with a real Muslim person. He had lost someone in one of the World Trade Towers, and he said, I just want to overcome my anger and separate that from the people who committed this, and to meet someone who was a Muslim. And so, it didn't involve at all a lecture about Islam or, any sort of more elaborate dialogue. As the caretaker of the mosque said, he just wanted to see a real live Muslim and talk to him. He cried on my shoulder, and I cried too. Now, that's the beginning of something that I think we need to be able to do much more of, just to meet people. I mean, eventually you can get around to theology, or if you're not interested in theology, to politics or world events. But the first thing you have to do is meet people. So it may seem simple, but that's that. Sure.
Chris Smith, club member. Of course, the spark of hatred that led to September 11th was fostered in a society that is not pluralistic, a society where proselytizing carries the death penalty. As our own pluralism is kind of challenged by this, are there lessons we should learn or things we should know about societies that are not pluralistic?
A lot. I think we need to know much more about societies in different parts of the world, including those who are some of our closest allies that are not pluralistic, and that we continue to support for reasons that are completely economic. I think of Saudi Arabia, for example, where we do not register the kind of critique that we have of of some of the, you might call religious human rights abuses that take place there. And I think part of our own responsibility is to speak more forthrightly about these issues. There was a time up until about 5 years ago when even our own Human Rights Commission that gathers material for the State Department didn't really pay any attention to religion as one of the categories of human rights. And of course we disagree with, with some of our neighbors in other parts of the world about the extent to which proselytism is, is acceptable. But that needs to be part of our dialogue. And yeah, I think that's about enough on that topic. We could go on, but I'm sure there are other questions. Yes.
Excuse me, Bill Savage, member. Bin Laden's called for basically a holy war, and the terrorism, as I see it, is definitely comes out of a deep religious fervor. How do we as a nation, thinking about terrorism, respond to to this holy war, whether we're not fighting it as a religious war, but in a way it is. So how can we deal with terrorism when it comes from such a deep religious basis?
Well, I think, you know, understanding the background and roots of this kind of, you know, very extremist fundamentalist movement is an important first step. One of the things that is typical of some of of many fundamentalist movements, but I think we can say this of several of the kinds of fundamentalist movements that have emerged out of the Middle East, is that among their first complaints are not sort of complaints about the United States or anyone else, but about some of their own governments that they see as betraying the principles of Islam. And we can see a bit of this in Egypt and the persecution of some of the Muslim Brotherhood by Sadat. We can certainly see it in bin Laden's critique of the government of Saudi Arabia. So it's not all a holy war against us. It is also a holy war, so to speak, to rectify what they see as a betrayal of Islam within some of the Muslim societies, Muslim majority societies. There is a very important way of, and here I would like actually, if we have some of our Islamic guests would like to speak to this, I'd like to hear them. There's an important way in which this term jihad or holy war, as we've heard many times in the last few weeks, is also misconstrued. It's always seen as if it were a hot war with guns, but as the Prophet Muhammad said when he had returned from a battle, I have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. And the greater jihad is the struggle which is ongoing to live a life of rectitude and righteousness within ourselves. And the lesser jihad is that is fought with weapons if need be to create a society that is righteous and just. And there is a way in which, to borrow a line from my friend Karen Armstrong, who was speaking about some of these things last week, and whose book, The Battle for God, I would actually recommend. A way in which we in the United States have launched the lesser jihad, so to speak. But we need still to participate ourselves in the greater jihad, which is to think deeply about some of the ways in which our own stance in the world has been perceived as arrogant, as uncaring, and as unjust, and as not even-handed in relation to other people. And these are difficult issues. These are not things that we can, we could spend weeks talking about them. And I'm sure in this room there are many, a whole range of opinions. But I think we might take a page from this word of the Prophet, that the greater jihad is actually the one in which we ourselves struggle. And I think the United States is involved in both of those today. Let me stop there.
Yes. Ray Polani, a City Club member. I perceive in your speech an effort to unite this pluralism in some way. And I'm reminded of a motto of the United States that says, E pluribus unum, one out of many. I suggest that probably all religions at some point have a very common important thread running through. And that is the respect and love for nature as being the mother of all, as being the absolute sine qua non. Without it, there is no life. So maybe would you comment on how we can unite ourselves, not only in this country, but in the entire world, in returning to nature as being really our mother, the one that we cannot live without, and we have abused in many, many ways.
Such an important topic. One thing that I would say is that there is probably no topic that produces a more energetic interfaith dialogue than the topic of humanity's relationship to nature. There are many people from World Wildlife Fund to the proponents of the Earth Charter in the United Nations who have really made this their primary goal, to bring together religious communities, which are, after all, even for the greatest cynic, the largest grassroots communities in the world, and try to do something about the devastation of the planet on which we live. And there we don't have the theological quarrels and contentions that one so often sees and must, in fact, expect over many of the issues of interreligious dialogue. There is a common concern that we need to find ways as religious people and religious communities to bring our lives into harmony with our teachings. Of course, that is easier said than done. In the United States, I would say one other thing, though. When you mentioned e pluribus unum, the unum is never going to be, I mean, you know, originally it was sort of e pluribus unum, one nation out of many colonies or states. And as long as we were talking about sort of European cultures, there was sort of a one out of many. But in religious terms, we're never going to become one out of many. That's not really the gist of that motto. And I think it would be a mistake to overemphasize the unum of our religious life at the expense of our diversity. I think we do, in fact, have and need to have a very clearly and increasingly clearly understood sense of where we are not alike, people of different religious communities, and also where we are. But this is not about creating a kind of religious Esperanto in which we all come to speak the same sort of vacuous language. We really do need to encounter one another with all of our angularities and our differences. And in the book, one of the things I write about is the Hindu religious community, because in a sense, they're the only ones that have a very good theology for this, for the e pluribus unum. That comes out of the Rig Veda, ekam sat vipraha bahuda vadanti, out of truth is one, and even the wise speak of it in many different ways. And so there's a kind of theological, you know, many ways of seeing and looking at the divine, and through it all, and underneath it all, and beyond it all, a sense of the compelling transcendence of divine unity. But e pluribus unum is a difficult matter when it comes to our... So political, that's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. Yes.
Carol Witherell, City Club member. You mentioned the time of not getting to know each other is over. And I'm wondering if this time is not also over, and that is the time for our nation to not be a full-fledged participant in trying to make the world a more sustainable place for all of its peoples and a more just place. Is that something that from our national leadership to every citizen that we need to rethink and wake up to? And if so, how do we do that? What role, for example, might the United Nations play, or the Jubilee movement and interfaith movement to reduce the debt for very poor countries with exorbitant interest rates? What are the ways that we could really participate as full-fledged participants in making a more sustainable
Got it.
world.
You've hit the nail right on the head. I think you already have suggested some good ones, but I think that the very resonance of some of these, you might say, the local issues that I've been talking about, to the global issues that we face, is really profound. Maybe the best thing that will come from this internationally is that we recognize that we cannot go it alone. I mean, you know, superpower, what does it mean to be a superpower in the world? It means looking out for the welfare of everybody, not just the people who are useful to us, and not just the welfare of our own citizens. And I think the evidence, if we look over the last few months, of what can well be construed as a kind of go-it-alone mentality, has been very disturbing, not just to those people who think of us as enemies, but to those people who think of us as friends in the international community. I mean, why did we walk away from the Kyoto Accords, for example? I mean, this is craziness in a world in which these are issues of concern to all of our neighbors on every continent. Or why did we walk away from the conference on race in South Africa? There is nothing in any of that would legislate that we have to vote on anything, yay or nay, that we disagree with. But to be at the table with our disagreements, with our voices, rather than to walk away. I mean, I think it's just supreme arrogance. And, you know, people who were at the conference on racism and returned to New York, like Patricia Williams, who's a professor of law at Columbia, and sort of looked at these two things together and said, you know, if we could even hear the voices that were articulated in Durban, hear them clearly, we would have a much better understanding of well, you could say of why this happened to us. There's no reason for this as a political strategy, this kind of terrorism for any group. But the sense of puzzlement that many people throughout the world have about our country, I think, is exactly what you're pointing toward. Yes, sir.
I'm Bill Homer, City Club member. Thank you for coming. I enjoyed your comments very much. As I understood your response to another question, I understood your response was to say that the fundamentalist Muslims weren't so much opposed to the United States as they were to some of their own governments. How does that square with their failure to oppose the secular government of Iraq?
Well, many of them did. I mean, in fact, Osama bin Laden was one of the first people to alert the Saudi government to to the dangers of someone like Saddam Hussein. And in fact, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he thought that he himself, Osama bin Laden, had the perfect Mujahideen army to help with the situation. And the Saudi government said, no, we've got our friends the Americans, they'll be here any moment. But I think we see some of this, of course, if any of you have friends or distant neighbors who are Christian fundamentalists, you know that their first argument is not with anybody else. It's not really with, with Muslims or Hindus. Their first argument is with other Christians. That is kind of the ground that animates them the most. And I have to say, as a progressive liberal Christian, it animates me quite a lot from the other side, too, as we're fighting for the very heart of our own tradition. These are the things that we get steamed up about. So it's an oversimplified way of looking at it, but I think that we need to see this in a broader context. Yeah.
Professor Eric, thank you very much. I'm glad that I've seen you finally. I participated in your project, the Pluralistic, in 1991 when one of your students contacted the local Muslim community. I am Wajdi Saeed. I'm a guest to the Trinity Cathedral, and I'm also associated with the Muslim Education Trust. I have a comment and a question. My comment is the issue of the holy war. This is a word that's been introduced, to Islam. It's not a Muslim terminology. It's rather than it's a Christian terminology that was invented with the Crusaders and later on with the Inquisition. The comment also that I have, Muslims during the glorious civilization of Islam in Spain or Baghdad or Cairo or Delhi or Lahore, we did have pluralistic society. We had everybody that participated with different ethnic groups and different religions. This is why communities like Jewish communities have flourished in Spain under Muslim rule. In Baghdad, in where I came from in Yemen, you know, I grew up and still we have Jewish Yemenis, and they are proud to be Yemenis and also Jewish. We had our, in response to the person that have raised the issue of pluralistic society, Muslims are proud of Islam and Islam's contribution to protect societies or communities within the fold of Islam. The second comment, or the question that I have, I'm glad that you also criticize Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And I would love you to elaborate in some of our strong allies here. Our country have a strong allies with Turkey that persecute Muslims and Muslim women and banning them from wearing their religious scarves. Country like Israel, you know, we have a lot. The issue in the Middle East is not the fight between Christianity and Judaism or Islam. You know, it's an issue secular versus it's a human rights issue that Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims being violated by secular Jewish or Zionists in particularly, not Jewish. So this is what I would like you really to elaborate, and also the issue of this Crusaders, you know, and they invented the holy war mentality. You know, the croissant that we eat, it was a fundraiser that that the French have invented, you know, to raise funds, you know, to finance the crusade, you know, to Muslim land. And not only they killed Muslims, they killed also Christians, you know, of Eastern Christianity Church. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it's important simply to say, because you've elaborated, I think, in a very informative way, but that we know perfectly well that all of our religious communities have some very, very dark days of their history, and that all of our religious communities are today multivocal. They have many different voices, many different people who are articulating and trying to articulate what it means to be a faithful Christian or Jew or Muslim in the kind of world in which we live, and in relation to people of other faiths and religious neighbors different from ourselves. So, part of our difficulty is that we, in any religious tradition, know very well the kinds of arguments that we engage in relation to our co-religionists. I say this as a Christian. I even say as a Methodist, because, you would think Methodists were just a tiny sect of Christianity and that they all agreed about things. But Methodists have very hot wars between themselves. So there are many voices, and yet we look at another religious tradition that we don't know very well and seem to think of it as kind of a monolith. And you raised the question of Turkey. I mean, there could not be three more different Islamic societies or countries than Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan, and Afghanistan. I mean, all sort of neighbors in one sense, and very different one from the other. So I think that beginning to develop some sort of more sophisticated knowledge of the currents of parts of the world that most Americans really have no knowledge of at all. I mean, most non-Muslims Americans know almost nothing about Islam. I mean, we have to be grateful for Oprah, or, for just the fact that in the last number of weeks, probably people have heard more Muslims speaking in their own voice on their own behalf and participating in kind of public discourse than they have in decades. So I think, these are all important things to bring up.